Today we're going to look at NS7. NS7 is where we're going to really focus on rationals, which are decimals and fractions added into our integers and whole numbers that we've already talked about. So again, here's our circles that we've used. We have whole numbers, which are 0, 1, 2, 3, 10, 1,000, and it keeps going infinitely. But there are no decimals, no fractions in that whole number, and they're all positive. Integers are where we start talking about our negatives, positives, and our neutrals. So if you are an integer, you're in that whole number circle and the opposites of the whole numbers. With rationals, we're going to start talking about decimals and fractions. So just a quick glance at what we have. If you are in a whole number, you are in all three of our circles. If you are an integer, you are an integer and a rational. That doesn't necessarily, if you're an integer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a whole number as well. So that can change. So let's look at a few of these. For instance, we have negative 12. Negative 12 has no decimal, no fraction. So we're looking at our integer and whole number, but it has a negative. So it can't be a whole number. It's just an integer and a rational. So the rational is the big circle, and our integer is a smaller circle, and the whole number is a smaller circle inside of it. All right, so make sure that you understand this concept. Then we have negative 7.3. So first of all, it's negative, and it's got a decimal. So the decimal is a big giveaway here that is only in our rational circle. Because it's a decimal or it could have a fraction, it is a rational. All right, then we have 4.1. Again, that is only a rational because it has a decimal. 6. Now, if you notice, 6 has no decimal, has no fraction, and it has no negative. So therefore, 6 is in all three of these circles because it is a whole number, which is an integer, which is also in our rational circle. So 6 is in all three categories. Then we have 3.5. So because it has a fraction, this is just in our rational circle. So a few more that I want to look at is maybe like negative 6. We know that 6 is a whole number, an integer, and a rational, but the negative 6 would only be considered an integer and a rational, not a whole number because it has a negative sign. Now let's look at some of the words that we need to look at, like opposite, absolute. Now we've talked about this in previous videos, but just to recap, opposites and absolutes are not the same thing. Opposites are on different sides of 0, but they have the same absolute value. Absolute value means distance from 0. So let's take into consideration we have a 3 2/3. 3 2/3 is positive, so it is 3 2/3 to the right of 0 on a number line. So its opposite would be negative 3 2/3. So these are opposites. Now with absolute value, it's a little different. The absolute value of 3 2/3 is 3 2/3 because, no, my 3's messed up, but 3 2/3 because it is 3 2/3 spaces from 0. So if you notice, the opposite of this positive is the negative, and the absolute value of this positive is still a positive because you're not asking for a direction, you are asking for a distance when you're talking about absolute value. Now we're going to look at the opposite of negative 6 3/4. Negative 6 3/4 is 6 3/4 spaces to the left of 0 on a number line. So the opposite of that would be 6 3/4 spaces to the right of 0 on a number line. So it's going to be a positive 6 3/4. So 6 3/4 and negative 6 3/4 are opposites. They have the same absolute value, but they do not have the same value. Let's make that clear. Absolute value here is distance from 0. So how far is negative 6 3/4 away from 0? It is 6 3/4 spaces from 0. Now again, absolute value is not asking for a direction, which would tell us positive and negative. It is asking for just how far is it from 0. One last thing I do want to explain here is if we had the opposite of the opposite. So the opposite of negative 6 3/4 is positive 6 3/4. But if you do the opposite of that positive 6 3/4, then it goes back to the negative, the original value. So the opposite of the opposite kind of flip-flops across that 0. If it's a negative, it's going to flip to the positive and then flip right back. So pay attention to if you see opposite, opposite of the opposite, and absolute value. They kind of mean the same idea, but they do not mean the same thing.